Welcome to the Modern Hippie podcast, where we'll be exploring all of my favorite boundary-pushing people and topics surrounding consciousness, psychedelics, mental performance, functional medicine, living in alignment, and so much more. I'm your host, Barrett Perlman, a former pro wakeboarder turned body worker, energy healer, and well, a modern hippie. And I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the Modern Hippie podcast. I am joined today by Ethan Nadelmann, who is the founder and former executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a leader in ending prohibition against marijuana and psychedelics, and host of the podcast Psychoactive. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ethan.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Barrett.
So you and I met recently at the Psychedelics Business Conference put on by the Marijuana Business Conference in Las Vegas. And I got to hear you speak. You opened the conference. And I love your passion. I love pretty much what it seems like you've dedicated your life to, which is really this policy reform and getting plant medicines and psychedelics out of this dark shadow that they've been in for so long.
Mm-hmm.
What got you into it?
Well, I'll tell you, really, Barry, I should stress that, my work was really directed at rolling back the entire war on drugs. And so that, as it evolved over the years, it really fell into three areas with my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, and then in some of the other stuff I did. 1/3 of it was ending marijuana prohibition. And so that was, first legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, and then decriminalizing possession and taking on the racially biased marijuana arrest, and then ultimately trying to replace marijuana prohibition policies with policies of responsible regulation. So that was about 1/3 of the work that I and my colleagues devoted on drug policy reform, but it probably got about 80% of the headlines because it's so dramatic. It's the one drug, the most commonly used illicit drug and all of that. The second third was about ending the role of the war on drugs in mass incarceration. It was very much the war on drugs that drove this extraordinary increase in incarceration in America, beginning in the 80s and 90s and into the aughts. And similarly, it was drug policy reform that was at the cutting edge of criminal justice reform in America, beginning in the 90s and into the aughts. And now it's, we've had quite a lot of success. The number and percentage of the prison and jail population locked up on drug charges has fallen quite substantially, not just with marijuana, but other drugs over the last number of years. And then the last third of the work was making a serious commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue. That meant advancing harm reduction strategies, beginning in the 90s with needle exchange and access to sterile syringes to reduce the spread of HIV and Hep C and all of that. And then taking on the overdose issue beginning over 20 years ago to try to reduce the rising number of overdose fatalities in America. And then trying to educate Americans about the more progressive drug policies in Europe and some other countries, and advancing a more kind of sex education model to drug education with young people. And then I should be frank, the psychedelic stuff, although I was always very personally passionate about it, it was never a major part of our agenda, in part because we focused so much on doing legislative reform and ballot initiatives. And there wasn't really the opportunity to do that politically by the time I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance 5 years ago. It's only very recently that you've seen these local and statewide initiatives on psychedelics. Meanwhile, I've been close friends with Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, since the late 1980s. And so we've found opportunities to collaborate over the years on legal issues or medical marijuana issues or certain psychedelic issues. But, go back to your original question, what got me interested in this in the first place, part of it was going off to college when I was 18 and smoking marijuana and, and going, why the hell is this stuff illegal? And that kind of stuck with me. And then years later, when I was in graduate school and law school, just thinking, God, this would be an interesting thing to do my dissertation work on and to focus on. And then just as I was finishing that in 87 and starting to teach at Princeton in the policy school in the politics department, the war on drugs was taking off like crazy. I mean, when I first got involved in this issue in the early 80s, it was just a backwater issue. But the drug war
Mm.
was the height of public interest, the number one issue in public opinion polls in the late 1980s. And I happened to write a couple of very prominent pieces, and all of a sudden catapulted into these 15 minutes of fame and became kind of the leading speaker in the US and around the world, basically questioning the war on drugs and saying that all sorts of alternatives, including legalization, had to be on the table. And meanwhile, there was the beginnings of a social movement to take on the drug war, and I got very deeply involved with that. And so I was speaking and writing and teaching about this stuff. And then after about, in early 90s, I got a phone out of, well, 30 years ago, I got a phone call out of the blue from a philanthropist who was not that well known back then named George Soros. And he invited me to lunch, and we hit it off, and one thing led to another. So I left the university and, started the organization, and then eventually became the leading organization in the world advocating for alternatives to the war on drugs, and da
Mm.
da da da. Da.
Wow. What a journey. What a journey from just
Yeah.
like smoking pot and loving it.
No, no kidding. I really feel like I've been very lucky and very blessed on this stuff. I mean, part of it was the fortuitous nature, to pick an issue that was a backwater issue. Well, when I started doing this in my dissertation work, people go, yeah, Ethan's not taking his career seriously. Why else would he start to work on drugs and international crime? But then to have that issue explode into the number one issue in public consciousness in the late 80s, that was fortuitous. Getting that phone call from George Soros in 92, that was fortuitous. So I had, a number of lucky breaks. But I'll tell you, Barrett, it also, I should say, it was a mushroom experience, since you're interested in
Mm.
psychedelics. In the summer of 89, I was at the annual Telluride Mushroom Conference in Telluride, Colorado, that Andy Weil and others organized. And I was up there speaking with him and such. And then that weekend, I did mushrooms for the first time. I hadn't done them in 7 years, since my young 20s and mid
Ooh.
20s. And it was really the moment. It wasn't an epiphany, but it was really a sort of concretization, the realization that my life, that teaching about drugs was really going to be the mission in my life. And that would be a
Mm.
vehicle for speaking about broader issues in our society beyond just drugs and drug policy, and that it didn't matter whether or not I stayed in academia or went into advocacy or journalism or politics, but this was going to be my focus. And to both have, stumbled on this issue and gotten involved in my mid 20s, and then to have this kind of clarity about the mission of my life in my early 30s. I mean, that's just also incredibly fortunate. And a psychedelic experience with mushrooms really helped me perceive that at a really, really valuable moment.
Oh, that's so fantastic. I love psychedelics for that specifically. I mean,
Yeah.
I mainly work with psilocybin, but I'm getting a lot more into ayahuasca lately. And the
Hmm.
things that you can be shown and the way that it'll reveal your path to you is unlike, you really don't get that from marijuana. And at least in my
No,
experience, having
that's
smoked.
right. It's interesting. I'm hearing a growing number of people talking about cannabis, about its psychedelic potential, and I
Hmm.
think there's a book about it now, cannabis, and I've heard other people talking about this. So I realize there's something there. But one of the things I think is also true about psychedelics, and for me, psilocybin mushrooms is really my key one as well. I've done mescaline and ayahuasca and 5-MeO DMT. I just tried changa for the
Mm.
first time a month or two
Ooh,
ago. Um,
how was that?
so I've tried a range of other things, but the mushroom thing, it's I've often found with marijuana, like I'll have all these great ideas, but then quite frankly, they just this kind of like flying away, like clouds disappearing, or in a way in the sky, and the next morning it's rare for them to have really great value. Although I do have some
Mm.
friends who will attribute some of their most brilliant ideas, whether in business or in academia, to marijuana. But I
Really?
find with the psychedelics that I've had really, sort of breakthrough experiences and ideas that remain with me for really for decades thereafter. I mean, for life.
Mm.
And so
Hmm.
there's some really great value there. I would say some of the best, probably the best letters I've ever written in my life were letters that I wrote in my head under the influence of mushrooms. And the
Ooh.
next day was able to return to that and write it down with utter clarity and then send it off
Mm.
to people, and in a way that was, incredibly, well received and oftentimes important in my relationships with people.
Oh, that's so cool. Cause yeah, I have similar experiences on marijuana where like I swear to God I solved the world's problems and then I
Hmm.
can't remember what the solutions were the next day.
Yeah, yeah, I know. There
But
have been times when I've like read a novel and under the influence of marijuana and just loved it, and the next day can't remember a thing about it. And with movies, I'm never quite sure. Sometimes I go to see a movie and I'm high, and I remember very little about it, which actually is not
yeah.
so bad because then I can go see it again. It's like seeing seeing it fresh. Other times I'll just have a vivid memory of it, and it's hard to predict. But
Mhm.
we do know when people ask about the issue of marijuana and memory, one thing that I learned decades ago from a couple of scholars, John Morgan and Lynn Zimmer, who wrote this book, Marijuana Myths, Marijuana Facts, was that, when we're high, we can remember things just about as well as when we're not high. Right. And that
Mm.
by and large, using marijuana does not really undermine one's memory. People are always afraid it does. I'm smoking too much pot. But the real
Mhm.
issue is that the things you learn while you're under the influence of marijuana you're less likely to remember in the future. And
Oh,
therefore, if you
shit.
spend a lot of time getting high, you're spending lots of time where the things that you learn, you may not remember as well as you would if you had learned those things when you were not high. So I think
Right.
that's the real issue of marijuana memory that it's important for them to sort out.
Right, whereas the flip side of that with psilocybin is, psilocybin actually builds new neural pathways, and they believe that what you learn on psilocybin, you're more apt to remember, and
Yeah.
it's easier
Well,
to
it's
learn
also
things.
I'm taking those, Paul Stamets sells all those little mushroom pills, and I'm taking the memory ones. I
Ooh,
call these pills my placebos. I have no idea if it really works. I think Paul Stamets is brilliant, and I think he's undoubtedly
yeah.
onto something. Now, whether these pills I try to take each morning, he's got one for immune system and one for memory, the one with the lion's mane. So
Mhm.
man, maybe it helps. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen big controlled double blind studies testing this stuff. Maybe they're out there. But yeah, only thing
Yeah.
that hurts is my wallet. Yeah.
Ooh, ouch. Yeah, I like thinking they work as well, but I would be interested in seeing some more of the double blinds, and I'm a lover of mushrooms. Ironically, I've my entire life I loved mushrooms. Just eating mushrooms, put them on everything. You can never put too many mushrooms on anything. And so now it's
Hmm.
kind of like come full circle
Yeah.
for me.
No,
But
I'm the same way. I mean, I've loved mushrooms as well. I mean, I didn't do the psilocybin mushrooms until my 20s, but I mean, just generally, there's the whole thing about dividing between microphobic and microphilic societies. The societies that hate
mm,
mushrooms, the societies that love them. In the classic book by Gordon Wasson about mushrooms in Russia, that was really a breakthrough book in the 1950s. I mean, he's kind of one of the
mm,
pioneers in this area.
yeah.
He's the same one who went down and kind of, found Maria Sabina and,
Hmm.
won her trust. And then unfortunately, she kind of landed up the worse off for having met him. But I mean, his experiences beginning with Russia and then going to, I think, Mexico, obviously played a very important role in kind of launching part of the first stage of the psychedelic revolution back in the 50s.
Yeah, and for those who are unfamiliar with that story, Robert Wasson went to Mexico and he met with a shaman woman, mushroom facilitator, Maria Sabina, and she had sort of been carrying this tradition of using psilocybin in ceremony. And they had him and his wife had these incredible moments and experiences on it, and they wrote an article about it in Time Magazine, and then people started flocking there. And
Life magazine.
oh, Life,
Life,
sorry,
which
thank you.
was then the huge magazine, the photo magazine of America back in the 50s and 60s. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I've always actually really honored Maria Sabina because she's a woman and I'm a woman, and she did mushroom ceremonies. I do mushroom ceremonies, and
Well, I got a
I
kick out of
honored
the
what she
fact that
carried.
I live on the Upper West Side, and for many years there was a wonderful little Mexican restaurant called Cafe Frida, which is actually where I celebrated my
Mm.
50th birthday with a whole lot of people. And they had a picture of Maria Sabina on the wall, and always was like a nice little connection, to have that there. Yeah,
I
yeah.
love that. And you said you did 5-MeO DMT as well. Was that recent?
Well, I mean, that was strange. It was about 3 years ago. I
Yeah.
was a bunch of people had been encouraging me to, like, smoke the 5-MeO DMT, and I was kinda scared, and then finally one day with a friend of mine who, I said, "Okay, I'm ready." And he said, Ethan, I'm sorry, I don't have the smokable version at home. I only have the snortable version.
There's a
And so I said,
snortable
well,
version?
yeah, I mean, who knew, right? And so I said, how long do you think it'll last? He goes, I don't know, smoke was like 15 minutes. This will probably be a half an hour or so. So he gave me these two lines to snort, right? Big lines. Burn like hell. I mean, burn like hell
Yeah.
for like 15 minutes or whatever. And then it comes on. And I have to tell you something. I mean, 5 hours later, right? I'm kind of coming out of it. I mean, I always knew where I was. I've always tended to be fairly grounded in these experiences. But 5 hours later, and I come out of it, and they ask me how it was, and I'm saying, "Oh, I think it was very, very good." And I literally, my mouth could
Oh,
not make
no.
words. And like even then, my appetite began to came back. And as I'm talking, I'm still talking like this. I don't know why you can't. And it wasn't until the next morning that that I could really begin to talk normally. And then I remember I had to drive home, but not drive home, drive to a friend's place. But it was like I almost didn't recognize any roads. I mean, it was powerful. My
Hmm.
host asked me. They said, "Ethan, were you doing Kundalini exercises?" I said, "What's Kundalini?" And well, they said, "Well, they explained to me what it was." He said, "I said, why do you ask that?" And it's because I was lying on my back and like my legs were like shooting out, like there was energy shooting out my legs. But it was to some extent for me like an extended, weird type of mushroom trip. It
Hmm.
wasn't the what I've heard about from other people and read about in terms of the 15-minute smoked 5-MeO DMT thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's a very different tale for sure.
Yeah, I
Except
know.
for
I
the
don't know
part.
anybody else who snorted it actually. And I don't think I'll do it again either, in part because it hurts. I mean, it burns so much, you know?
Yeah, the smokable version doesn't burn so much. It's even better
Yeah.
tasting than DMT. But for me, I also run the gamut of what my facilitator says. I do the hip Olympics, and my
What's the Hip
hips are
Olympics?
just where my hips are all over the place. Like I'm stretching my hips in every which direction you can possibly imagine, and rolling all over the floor. And
Uh-huh.
but
Wow. That's
yeah, but
interesting. Have you
it's
tried
well
it with
from
the vape pen as yet? The
uh
5-MeO DMT vape pens?
no, I haven't.
That seems
I
to be, I
look.
mean, this seems to be becoming this thing, and so I'm
Mm,
eager to try it soon. But what it allows you to do is to titrate the dose, and so rather than going into that 15 minutes of your whole that goes on forever or it doesn't, and everything, the dramatic experience, people are titrating the dose and finding a comfort level, and they're saying it leaves them. I mean, depending on the dose, but can leave you with a tremendous sense of well-being in the immediate
mm.
aftermath, and that you're able to use it more often. And there's not much research about what are the health, benefits or risks involved with doing this stuff. But I'm eager to try it in that form and see what that's like.
I would be interested. That's probably a really low dose. So, like, I've done it 3 times. My first time, I started at like 63 milligrams. My second time, I started at 72 milligrams and I had a complete whiteout, like, didn't remember anything. And that was my most challenging one. And then this last time, I did 36, which was significantly lower than the other ones. And I had the most
Mm-hmm.
amazing time I've ever had. And,
Mm-hmm.
but you couldn't take 36 and then like go walk your dog around the block, like
Yeah.
let alone drive a car. Like you need to
No,
be
no,
there on
no,
the
and I
floor.
think this friend who's told me about it, I mean, he's got, like, 3 different vape pens of different concentrations, so you can really
Oh,
titrate the
interesting.
dose, both by how long you inhale as well as by which dose you're taking,
I
and
should
so
look into that.
I am curious to try that. But why was the one where you don't remember anything the most difficult?
um oh, there were a few reasons why. I had had such a powerful experience the time before, and I went into the second time wanting to do a bigger dose to see what would happen deeper in it, and I got really wrapped up in wanting to remember the words, wanting to remember how to
Mhm,
describe the experience, and
mhm,
so I didn't really surrender into the experience, and I was doing Bufo specifically, so
mhm,
so that's a Bufo specific dose, not a 5-MeO synthetic dose. Synthetic doses are about a third of what Bufo is for
mhm,
the similar effect. And yeah, so in Bufo, you really have to surrender. The less you surrender, the harder it's going to be. That's kind of where people end up vomiting or forgetting to breathe or things like that. And um, so I really struggled. I know there were some times where my facilitator really had to coax me to breathe, and but I don't remember any of it. It just, he calls it a whiteout instead of a
Hmm.
blackout, where it's just all, there's nothing there. I literally can't grasp a single memory from it.
It's very
And
interesting because my experience when I did Changa a month or two ago, about a month and a half ago, and the same thing. You take it like DMT. You inhale, deeply, and
mhm,
and it comes on phew, like so fast, right?
yeah,
And some of that similar imagery with I would get with sometimes when I um uh yeah, another experience like that, almost like a um what's the word? It's almost like this electrical imagery and this kind of
mm,
But what happened was I had some imagery, and then then like next thing I know, the fellow who's sitting with me is kind of talking to me. He sees me moving, and I'm coming out of it, and he said it was like 15 minutes, and apart from that, this, I don't know, 30 seconds of the entry and the 30 seconds
mm,
of the exit, I had no recollection. It wasn't at all difficult.
mm,
It was just like having a blackout or whiteout. I have
yep,
no memory of what happened. It was like I was just knocked out or something for that, so it was kind of a
yeah.
odd thing. And I didn't really know what to make of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was what happened to me the second time. The entire time, then I did a second
Hmm.
smaller dosage, and again, kind of struggled to surrender into it. And the next thing I know, I'm coming to being like, "Wait, I don't remember anything. How do I describe that? Wait, now I should have surrendered. I spent this whole time not surrendering." And for
Hmm.
me, that became the most powerful, one of the most powerful lessons I've had this year about
Hmm.
surrendering and the importance of showing up to surrender, and especially with plant medicines, to be there to do the work for myself first and to serve my community with the lessons from it second.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it carried over this beautiful idea of surrender, that I was like, oh, I'm not surrendering in this part of my life. And now I'm going to Peru. And I had planned to try to figure out how I could work every single time that I had a moment in Peru. And I was like, wait, I'm
Hmm.
not even going to surrender on this trip that I'm anticipating to change my life. Like, so I focused on surrendering there, and it's now become just one of the most powerful words on my radar. And
Aha, that's
I tie
interesting.
it back to starting at that Bufo journey, that Bufo, that specific second ceremony.
Vis-a-vis the
And
importance of surrender and
oh yeah,
surrendering and going in with
yeah,
the intention to surrender.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Um,
don't, I'm trying to think if that's been my, yeah, I mean, I know very much don't fight it. I'm trying to think if I don't know if I think about it as surrender though. Um, and it's interesting also. I mean, I've always tended to stay fairly grounded, even when I've taken, like, I mean, sometimes I'll take very high dose mushrooms. I haven't done it recently, but I would do five or
mm,
six, grams of dried mushrooms. So a really
hmm.
big dose, and,
Heroic dose.
kind of could look psychotic, and you don't want to let me out of the house type of thing. But I mean, but even then, I kind of know who I am, where I am. I'm not really
Mm,
surrendering. It's kind of, like a powerful force coming into me that's just kind of going in directions that I have some ability to move in one direction or the other. But you know and
yeah.
then on a couple of times it's gone into a dark direction. you know I mean, there I basically have had pursued two approaches. One, I guess I've had two times the mushrooms where it went into a very dark place, a very deep depression, and one time I
Mm.
just took some MDMA, and that just kind of lifted me out of it. It felt a little bit
That'll
like
solve it.
cheating, but it was very nice. But the second time, I was in a very, very dark place. And in that case, I just decided, like, dive into it the way you would dive into a
Mm,
huge wave that you can't run away from at the beach. And that
hmm.
turned out to be the solution there, because when I came out of that wave, all of a sudden the depression, receded and faded, and things opened up to great beauty and joy. So
Mm,
it wasn't quite surrender. It was just, I mean, it was the sense like you can't run, you
right.
better, you know, like go dive in, and have confidence you're going to come out, the other end of this thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a solid difference between psilocybin and 5-MeO DMT, is like with the psilocybin, I call that leaning into the experience and going deeper
Mm-hmm.
into whatever's coming up that's dark. So like
Mm-hmm.
you specifically dove into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with the 5-MeO, it's almost like a relaxing and a surrender, like not trying to fight the fact that you have no idea and can't explain what this medicine is doing to your body in that moment.
Right.
Um, because
Right.
it does something that you've probably never experienced before.
Yeah.
And I think of ketamine the same way. Like ketamine is like a four-dimensional experience. It actually makes your physical body feel like it's moving places and doing
Hmm.
things that you never feel on psilocybin, on marijuana,
Well, I'll
on.
tell you, I just did the I had done, I mean, years ago I had done this unusual ketamine DMT combination,
What?
that a
Awesome.
friend of mine had designed, and was his name was Sean. Then he went through a transformation. Sean Haley.
Mm,
And went around dosing his friends. That was fascinating. But when I did the ketamine, not first orally, under the tongue with lozenges at a pretty high dose, and then the second time intramuscularly, with a physician. And
mm,
and I have to say that really, I was surprised at its power. I mean, I did also, unlike when I've done mushrooms, I was either wearing eye shades or in a totally blacked out room, so that helped.
hmm
But I noticed that that kind of letting go and that floating feeling and being in places, and that was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I felt more ungrounded in a good way, than I
mm.
ever had with any experience with ayahuasca or mushrooms. So that was, yeah, and it was short, but it was powerful and beautiful.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I rarely get a chance to talk to people who've also had deep ketamine experiences. Would you describe what you were in as like a K hole?
I was wondering because people have asked me that, and since I don't know what their K hole experience is like. I mean, I remember first hearing about K holes, when I was working on this issue from a harm reduction perspective when I was running DPA, and ketamine took off in the whole gay dance scene in New York, and people were describing K holes, and we had to teach people that just because people look like they're unconscious, it's not like an opioid overdose. You don't have to have an intervention. Don't give them a Narcan. Don't
Right.
call the emergency services. Just let them get through it. So I don't know if
Mhm.
it was, but for me, there were two elements of the experience. The first time I did it, the second time I did it, it was just a beautiful thing, kind of floating out, like almost floating in outer space, like in one of these movies about
Mm,
people out in outer space, and just a lot of kind of thinking through about relationships in a very empathic way. More so than I would normally do in my normal conscious life. But the
mm.
previous time, there were two things that were interesting about it. The first one was, I don't. This story is too long. I don't think it's too long, but we'll see. Um,
We got time.
I'd been reading this book. It was the biography of Frederick Douglass, right? The famous, black anti, abolitionist, anti-slavery, leader in America in the middle of the 19th century, who was probably heard more people probably heard him speak live than any other figure in American history up through the beginning of the 20th century. Right.
Mm,
And the day before, I've been reading the chapter. The book's by David Blight, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. This is a few years ago, and I've been reading the chapter where John Brown, the white kind of radical, almost biblical type prophetic figure who leads the raid on Harper's Ferry and is another great abolitionist leader. And he and Frederick Douglass had this relationship of great respect for one another and some personal closeness. And
mm,
and Brown asked Douglass to come see him, and there's this meeting where Brown is planning this raid, and Douglas realized that this is basically a suicide mission. That there's no way it's going to happen. And Brown's saying, "You have to come. You have to come. You have to come." And Douglas is as nicely as possible, even though he believes in the use of violence to overthrow slavery, knowing that this is not it. And anyway, the ketamine comes on the next day, and I felt like I'm in the room with these guys, and
ooh,
for me also, just having, for me, having built seeing myself as a social justice leader, building a drug policy reform movement, the people who had been civil rights leaders, abolitionist slavery leaders, women's rights leaders, gay rights leaders, these are sort of like my kind of, big picture role models in life. And so to
mhm,
have these two of the probably the most famous and revered, radical, abolitionist leaders of the mid 19th century, and to be in there feeling that whole thing with a vividness that was just extraordinary. And then
mm,
that kind of faded, and I rolled over, and I then went into um this world that was almost like Avatar, the movie Avatar, and
yes.
it was like I was underwater, like in a swamp, and I'm like in this
Mm.
swamp, and I'm going, I'm underwater. I can't breathe, but I'm breathing actually. And
Mm.
then I'm looking around. It's dark and it's murky. I can't see in front of me at all. I'm going, this is scary. It's like there could be snakes and monsters and all this, but I don't feel scared. And I just keep sort of like,
Mm.
kind of moving forward underwater. And then I have this thought like, my God, this is the way I could transition into death in a way without fear. And it was the
Mm.
only time in my life I've ever had that sensation or feeling or thought. But it was very, whether I actually will ultimately one day do it that way or not, I don't know. But it was nice to have that kind of thought and feeling under the ketamine in that
Mhm.
experience. I think it stayed
Mm.
with me, and I think it'll stay with me for the rest of my life. And hopefully stay with me when I'm transitioning out of my life. We'll see, you know.
Yeah, just get some more for that moment.
Yeah, really.
But it's interesting to hear you say that because I always feel like ketamine is kind of like hopping on a ride. And there's something about the visions where you're like always moving forwards in them.
Hmm.
That has been my experience. And they're
Hmm.
they're constantly like evolving, almost like you're on a ride at Universal. And you're like going through scenes and looking at things, and you'll stop and you'll pivot as the ride's still going, and you look around. But I rarely get a chance to like stop and sit in those moments. But I tend to fly around a lot, like in outer space, and see
Hmm.
civilizations and things made up of energy, and um, I mean, I guess they're all different, really. Like, and you're always flying. So I'm always
Well,
flying.
it's because
And
look, we're bringing our own, pre-existing consciousness to these things. I mean, it's so obviously that's going to shape it and determine it. Although I was recently listening, what's the guy's name? Somebody, who's he's got a podcast and books where he argues that consciousness actually exists outside of our minds. He
mm,
challenges the fundamental notion that all consciousness really derives from essentially human consciousness, and that's what Ben argues,
hmm,
that there's something that exists independently, a broader consciousness that our brains are just part of, receiving from and contributing to, but that it exists in its own independent right. So I don't know.
mm,
In that case, that could also explain some of the universalities. He makes a kind of persuasive case for this
right.
kind of heretical radical argument. I wish I could remember his
Hmm,
name.
hmm. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, yeah, and the lessons that you sort of learn when you're in those space, they apply to, I think, everyone's experience, and what we should be drawing into our knowledge base, our remembering of what it's like to not just be a consciousness trapped in this body. But I had another instance where on ketamine, I got turned into a piece of sand, and I got built into a set of stairs, and I got left there. And I it was beautiful because I actually got to feel what it was like to be something that we consider so minute and so unimportant, but yet it was all interconnected with everything around it, and it just served its purpose, and I was happy. And it was a really
Hmm.
interesting
Wow.
interesting
I've never had
experience.
that kind of thing. That sounds wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's think about
Yeah.
sand next time.
Yeah, right. Actually, interestingly, the one time I had that very dark experience on mushrooms, where I dived into the wave, kind of figuratively, but it was actually on a beach. It was in Montauk, New York, at the tip end of Long Island,
Mm.
and I was on a beach, and everything just looked bleak as hell. And I'm looking at the sand, and all the sand looks like it's dead skeletal fossil stuff, like
Ooh.
crumbled fossils and such. It was just, everything looked dead and dark, and then and literally when I did that dive into the wave, part of the dive was on the literal element of it, was actually diving into the sand, as I'm diving into the wave in a more figurative way, and then
Oh,
coming out
wow.
of it. Yeah.
Wow. Love that. Ah, so I
Isn't
want
it
to
nice that
circle.
we can actually talk about these? I mean, you realize for decades of my work, it was really impossible to talk about this stuff openly. I mean, even in the original years, I
Really?
couldn't even really talk about marijuana use. And I was always very careful about the way I referred to my own marijuana use, because it was that
Mhm.
period in the late 80s and into the 90s when there was massive drug testing, a massive drug war, incredible demonization. Back, and I come of age in the late 70s, going to college in the late 70s, when it was a very much a live and a let live era. And then to have the whole thing go clamping down, closing down, like what we thought that is, you had this notion that, well, that freedom naturally expands, right, in a free society. But then you see, in
Mm.
fact, of course, you look historically, it doesn't always go that way. And in fact, we always have to be aware that everybody's accustomed and used to this notion of increasing freedom, and psychedelics initiatives are winning, and all, and marijuana is getting legalized around the country and around the world. But things can, in fact, turn the other way, and have turned the other way. It's and so, yeah, and I think for people your age and, a little older or younger, it's hard to imagine that period where you really had to be careful about what you said, and to say this stuff
Mhm.
publicly. And certainly, and I remember even tiptoeing into my being open about my own psychedelics use, and like finding some places in a sympathetic crowd where it was not being videotaped, and saying, okay, I can do it there. And then we're
Mm.
always referring to it in the past tense. But it was a slow evolution of trying to figure out what are the right moments, and obviously the importance of people coming out about their personal use. But for me,
Mhm.
running a drug policy reform organization is relatively easy to do. But tens of millions of Americans living in places where they're drug tested, or where they could be fired, or in parts of the country where they would be disapproved of. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard, about parents, finding out that they're that they're that the parents of their kids' friends won't allow their kids to come over to their house because, oh, that parent's talking about their own drug use. I mean,
Wow.
there was a real extremism about this stuff, very much parallel to the way homosexuality was handled. And
Mm.
it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of a mark of kind of older, social justice warriors like myself, but it's been true of every social justice movement, that we're very proud of the victories we won. And part of what we're proud of is the fact that, a new generation coming up has a hard time imagining what that oppressive reality was like. On the other hand, there's a part of like being a little pissed off, like, fuck, I mean, young people don't even understand this. They know this. They just take this freedom for granted. They think they're goddamn inventing the world, and have no idea of the struggles that went before to actually create this level of freedom.
Mm.
So it's I do think it's really important for younger people to kind of understand this history, in the same way that people who are gay, should understand what people fought for and went through in previous generations, and what people who subjected to racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry have dealt with, to understand
Mm.
this evolution. And in part because it's also important to avoid having this stuff bubble up again, or to know how to deal with it when it bubbles up again. You know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, fuck yes. And thank you for shedding light on that. Thank you for the work that you did to enable this to be so. I mean, I'm 36 years old, and
Hmm.
I only started speaking publicly about doing mushrooms in May of
Wow.
this year.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I was sort of on
Yeah.
that bandwagon where it was like, oh, if I'm going to post it to Instagram in my story, I'm going to do close friends only. So like, who are my close friends?
Uh
And
huh.
then even with marijuana, I don't think I posted publicly about marijuana until maybe like I moved to California in 2010s, and where it was like, medically legal. So maybe not even until like
Yeah.
2012, 2013, where I was like, fuck it, it's legal here. If someone has a problem, like they can figure it out.
Right.
But
But I mean, obviously, for a lot of people who are thinking about their future, I mean, how many people I know who worry about, what if my employer wants to know? What if they want to
right.
drug test me? What if I want to,
Mm-hmm.
go work in government? What if I want to run for political office? What if, all sorts
Mm,
of things.
mhm.
Or I think I can't tell you how many people I know, people who, who had children, and then they
Yep.
get divorced, and one parent uses marijuana and the other one doesn't, and that lands up being something that can be used by the non-consuming parent against the consuming parent, and things like custody battles and things like this.
Right.
So it's just, I mean, God, I was just in touch recently with a fellow named Andrew Feldmar, a Hungarian Canadian psychotherapist, in Vancouver. And he had contacted me 15 years ago. He'd been going back and forth to the U.S. to visit his family forever. And one day he's going back, and one of the customs immigration officers, Googles him and finds an academic article where he talked about using LSD as part of the legal LSD experiments back in the 60s, and kept him from coming to the United States to visit his kids. And since that
No
time, he's not been
way.
able to get back to the United States. So, I mean, there's still that kind of crazy shit going on. you know. And I mean,
Wow.
God, you look what's going on in Russia now with, fucking Putin and what he's doing to, the basketball star and all this stuff. I mean, you realize,
Mm.
God, could my public revelation about this stuff be used against me if I want to go to a place like Russia or Saudi Arabia or Singapore or something like that? So,
Mm.
it's still not totally safe. And then, if as you do, as I was just doing recently, watching the TV series Handmaid's Tale, that's a
Oh,
real
yeah.
nightmare scenario, but where
Huh.
you see how, in fact, things can, in fact, go. I mean, a whole story is about things going backwards in a kind of fascist, semi-totalitarian way, and
Mm.
you realize so. And with
And
America being so screwy these days, and with the rise of sympathy for authoritarian and neo-fascist and even fascist,
mm.
leadership. We do have to be careful about this stuff.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you think could make, as you say, the pendulum swing in the other direction? Like, what would
Back
take
in
us
our
from
way, you
this?
mean, or back
What would
back in our
take us
direction, or
away
in the
away from our direction? So away from the acceptance that it's gaining. What would swing us towards, cracking back down on psychedelics and.
Well, I mean, look, we know there's always a pendulum that swings, right? We know that the anti-marijuana folks have mostly lost, but they keep looking for opportunities to draw a line in the sand. And so right now, what they're trying to
Mm.
do is obviously the whole issue around highly potent cannabis, which is a real issue. I mean, people have to be careful
Hmm.
around that stuff when you get, cannabis, being available at 60 or 70% THC. I mean, when I've done the few
Holy
times I've
shit!
dabbed. Well, if you've ever dabbed, I mean, the few times I've dabbed, it's like, huh? I mean, it's like the
I'm
crack
useless
version of
when I dab.
marijuana. Yeah. Well, I mean, exactly. It's like I know I got like 3 minutes or 5 minutes to keep standing, and then I better get horizontal. And I don't see the
Yeah.
point of it, but some people relish it. So you see, there's some of that, and obviously there will be at some point there's inevitably an increase in cannabis use among adolescents. It tends to move up and down irrespective of what the policies are. But when it does go up, there will be a renewed, clamor, and people will start to use the same arguments about protected kids. So that's on cannabis.
Mm.
I think with psychedelics, um, it's a range of things. I mean, obviously there will be injuries and fatalities. I mean, as there were back in the day, there'll be people doing dumb stuff, right? There will
Hmm.
be illicitly produced psychedelic synthetics that people will die from. The stuff that's going on now, that the more you have psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, I mean, all of therapy has problems involving sexual misconduct, right? And there's
Yeah.
no way that the psychedelic therapy field is going to be immune from that, right? So that's now
Hmm.
become an issue. I think it's useful to put that in the perspective that although you want the total number of incidents to be zero, that it exists in the broader therapy world as in the psychedelics world, but there are obviously particular vulnerabilities associated with doing a psychedelics contest or an MDMA
Right.
context. So that stuff, it's important for that stuff to be called out and to be addressed and taken on. You can't hide from it. On the other hand, the downside of some of the media attention on that stuff is it puts out a negative message on that stuff. So I think you have to balance the need for that stuff to be aired and to be made visible and dealt with the way it's put out there, and the risks that could happen in terms of making less. I just saw that there was a lawsuit that MAPS just was a jury just found them that they have to pay $1 million to the parents of a girl who was at one of their Zendo harm reduction tents. And
What?
and the jury found that they did not provide proper care, and so Zendo Maps, which
Hmm.
runs the Zendo harm reduction project at concerts and events, and even more so the hosts of the thing. So it wasn't just them; it was the major events. But they had to pay millions of dollars. And I mean, Maps is
Wow.
still in ongoing litigation about this. But you realize when that sort of stuff happens, it's a tragedy, and you want everybody to do better. On the other hand, the net result of that sort of stuff could be to dramatically reduce the amount of harm reduction services made available. Because if
Hmm.
people feel that we're going to try to help people, and if we screw up, we're going to be sued and have to go out of business, or fire a dozen staff, you may say, well, that's too risky a project to undertake. So it's a
Right.
tricky thing. So I And we have to remember too with psychedelics, I mean, yes, these ballot initiatives, one in Oregon and Colorado, and that's very promising, but still the majority of Americans don't know what we're talking about. And and the majority of Americans substantially have not done these substances. And people are always looking and ready to be scared and looking and ready to want to crack down. So
Hmm.
I think there will be some pendulum swinging the other way at some point. The question is how hard and fast it goes and how prepared we are to deal with it. When I was kind of building up our drug policy reform work, and especially around our work around drugs and kids, for me, I looked very closely at the marijuana reform movement of the 70s, both in terms of what they did right, looked at in retrospect, in terms of
Hmm.
mobilization and getting 11 states to decriminalize marijuana possession in the 70s and a range of other things
No
and
shit.
the beginnings of the medical marijuana movement, but then also the things they did wrong, which was assuming they had the majority of the public with them when in fact the public opinion polls showed they barely had a third, assuming that they could call out,
Mm.
sympathetic leaders, and challenge them before they were really able to deliver, given the broader politics. And then also, there was a moment in the late 1970s when the surveys showed that something like, one out of every 10 high school seniors was smoking marijuana daily. And nobody really wants
Ooh.
high school kids smoking weed daily. And so there was a
Yeah.
legitimate parental concern then. And the early stages of the marijuana movement did not really know what to do with that, right? So when we began to,
Mm.
gain speed in the 90s on that, and we set up a project Safety First, to deal with the issue of drugs in kids, we were very attentive to the concerns of parents, the real concerns of parents. So you have to constantly, be watching your flank and playing defense at the same time as that you're pursuing offense. And that's part of what
Mm.
can, ward off things going too much backwards when, the media and the public is ready to turn that direction.
Yeah. And where is marijuana now? Like, what's the status of marijuana policy reform?
Well, I mean, the progress is still remarkable. I mean, just this past election day, where Maryland and Missouri voted to legalize, so that now makes 21
Oh,
states, including
wonderful.
another basically red state, Missouri. You know, the ballot initiatives in some other states. What was it? The Dakotas, both Dakotas, and I think the last one was maybe Arkansas. That those were defeated, but they got 40 something% of the vote. And the South Dakota one had actually won a
Mm.
few years before, but the governor had kind of cut its legs off. So I think if you look at public opinion polls, if you look at the waves of legislative reform, the ballot initiative, state legislative reform, I think we're going to see quite likely Minnesota may go soon, some other states. So it seems quite inevitable, that progress. The bigger debates now, and for a whole new generation of marijuana reformers, it's less about whether we're going to legalize and more about how we're going to legalize, and whether it's going to be done in
Mm.
ways that help the quote unquote legacy markets, the people who've been growing marijuana illegally for a long time, whether it helps,
Hmm.
people of color who've been disproportionately, arrested and harmed by the war on drugs and the war on marijuana, whether it's going to help small business folks as opposed to the bigger business players. And in fact,
Mm.
one thing, for many of us, we always assumed that federal descheduling of marijuana, there's de facto marijuana legalization at the federal level, was the
Right.
kind of gold ring, the big prize. But many of us are having questions about that now, because once that happens, that opens up the door to big alcohol, big tobacco, and big consumer good companies getting into this business. And that's going to transform it in ways which may work out better for your ordinary consumers, but by and large is not going to be, from a probably a public health or broader economic benefit thing, a good thing. And
Right.
so, I'm trying to, kind of, I mean, we're all trying to figure all this stuff out, about what the world should look like. Meanwhile, one of the big marijuana organizations, has asked me to join their board, and I'm trying to think, do I want to join the board of a big marijuana organization? And part of it is, well, this would be, lucrative and really interesting, and I'd actually have some influence on the inside. On the other hand,
Mm.
I've kind of been a small is beautiful kind of advocate for a long time. So, there's all these dilemmas to try to think through.
Yeah. And where do you see like psychedelics fitting into to that? Or are we sort of really far behind considering, you just said 21 states have gone legal in some way in marijuana and now we're two for psychedelics, or are we catching up super quick? And
Well, I'll tell you, Barrett. I mean, they proceeded. I mean, some of it's parallel in the sense that the psychedelics reform, on one level, began. I mean, there's been sort of three strands, right, of psychedelics reform. Right, one
mm,
has been this remarkable scientific research that's going on, that's being done, that raised a lot of money for philanthropic money to try to get MDMA approved by the FDA, and they're getting close and close, but it's taken hundreds of millions of dollars to get there, and
yeah.
it's challenging for a nonprofit to try to do that sort of thing, especially when for-profit investors are showing up now and putting money in. Right, I mean, the more that
Hmm.
for-profit folks come in, I found this with the marijuana thing, the more that people began to see an opportunity to make real money in marijuana, the less people wanted to make a philanthropic contribution to support marijuana reform. Right, many of my
Mm,
key philanthropic donors at some point started to say, Ethan, let the people who are making money from this stuff pay for it. We don't want to do that anymore. And now the psychedelics field is dealing with that as well. I mean, Rick Doblin at MAPS and I
mm,
talk about this a fair bit. But what I would say is you have that medical scientific side, right, where MDMA is going to get approved by the FDA. Psilocybin is going to get approved maybe a little after that for severe depression. Then these things will be available for other medical conditions. Major university research centers. Michael Pollan's breakout book, How to Change
mm,
Your Mind. I mean, all of these things are proceeding in a way which I don't think is going to stop. And I think some of the excitement will wear off, both as we see that, nothing's going to solve the human condition, right? But
yeah.
and there's a sense of great hope and optimism about this stuff. But it is real. I mean, the research results are real and are substantial and are
Hmm.
significant. And the field of psychiatry is so kind of lost in many ways that this could really revolutionize the field of psychiatry. Then you have the other strand, right, which is the decrim stuff. And that was
Hmm.
all the local initiatives beginning in Denver a few years ago, and then Oakland, and passing through city councils, and more and more of those popping up to basically decriminalize possession, and maybe even decriminalize the kind of small level production or small level sharing. And that's somewhat similar to the marijuana reform movement. Remember, the medical marijuana thing moved forward not in the way the psychedelics thing was. It wasn't the big thing that was driving reform. For us, medical marijuana was more of
Hmm.
a political battle in which we used the sympathetic victims of the war on marijuana, who were using marijuana as medicine, as the way to move people's consciousness around this issue. But these local initiatives are similar to the marijuana thing, and they're spreading around the country. And then in the middle, you have kind of what Oregon and I think Colorado has done in their ballot initiatives, which is both a decriminalization of possession element, right? But also a kind of not a medical model, but a therapeutic model where trained
Hmm.
therapists who don't have to be credentialed with, MDs or PhDs can actually, do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So it's a kind of in between, a hybrid type of thing. So I think that's, I think the psychedelics thing has moved forward more quickly in the last 5 years than I think marijuana ever moved forward in 5 years. I mean, I look back to the
Mm.
first medical marijuana initiative in California back in 1996, which I didn't draft, but I was the one who kind of raised all the money and put together the campaign. And
Oh,
then the six
cool.
we did right after that in 98, 99, 2000 in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine. That was pretty rapid stuff, but it wasn't with the magnitude in a way. I mean, it was breakthrough, but the psychedelics thing has had a level of energy that's really been quite remarkable. So I don't know if it's going to keep moving forward state by state. We'll see what happens with ballot initiatives 2 years from now, whether Washington or California or Nevada or maybe someplace in the East tries to do a psychedelics initiative. I mean, the psychedelics thing does
Hmm.
seem to have there's more openness in the West than there is to East, which was also true of the
Yeah.
early years of medical marijuana. Um, we'll have to see how it goes. But I think it's definitely got a lot of momentum behind it. I don't think that's gonna drop off radically anytime soon.
Yeah. And is there something that we can do on the national level? Like I know Biden signed into agreement that by 2024 he wanted psychedelic therapies to all be legal in the United States. But it was like,
Well, I
what
mean,
does
he
that
set up
mean?
this task force, right? He set up a task force, and it's got good people on it. I mean, the thing that's pathetic has been the failure of the federal government to fund much in the way of psychedelics research, apart from ketamine, the one legal
Hmm.
psychedelic, until really like a year or two ago. And even now, it's a pittance. And so, people are, upset about the whole role of capital and for-profit players in this stuff, and how they're, trying to get patents for things that some which are reasonable, some which are not. But it's also about, I mean, one way to do that is to have the government putting large amounts of money into research in this area. And
Mm,
and the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and the other institutes within the National Institute of Health that are dealing with areas where psychedelics are helpful, not just with addiction, but all sorts of other sorts of things. National Institute for Mental Health, NIMH. National Institute of Cancer, where there may be some interesting stuff there. So I think that's a pivotal thing that the federal government can do. I think the
mm,
second thing is basically just getting these substances the hell out of Schedule One. Like right now, there's a bill
right.
that was introduced by Senator Cory Booker and Senator Rand Paul, the Libertarian Republican from Kentucky, and the prominent, senator from New Jersey, basically to allow any Schedule One drug, right, like psilocybin or MDA or anything like that, where the FDA has given it breakthrough status or where there's substantial evidence about its medical efficacy, to be essentially treated like a Schedule II drug in terms of being able to do research and things
Mm,
like that. So I don't know if that bill can get any traction, but it's those sorts of things to remove the onerous and ridiculous and backward and non-scientific overregulation at the federal level, together with
hmm.
allowing a serious flow of funding to come through. I think those are probably the two things that would be most valuable. Now, of course, if we get a president one day who talks about the role of psychedelics in their own positive transformation, that would probably help as well.
Mm.
Having
That's
some
super
leading
helpful.
political figures talk honestly about that, or other highly respected Americans, I think, especially non-politicians who are less polarizing but very popular, I think that
Mm.
I think that would also make some difference.
Yeah, like when Aaron Rodgers came out talking about doing ayahuasca and how it helped him win his
Yes,
last two MVP titles. It was mentioned to
exactly. Or the
someone the other
same,
day. I was like, "Oh yeah, I just got back from
or
Peru and I was doing ayahuasca." And he was like, "Oh, the Aaron Rodgers play." And I was like, "Well, I've been doing ayahuasca since
yeah.
before Aaron Rodgers talked about
Yeah,
it,
no,
but sure."
exactly, but it's true. It's I mean, when Steve Jobs basically said, I think he said that he probably wouldn't have done what he'd done if he hadn't done psychedelics, and
Mm,
there were all other Nobel Prize winners who attributed, in some cases, marijuana, in some cases, psychedelics to their breakthroughs, their intellectual breakthroughs that
hmm.
have really revolutionized, technological developments in America and sometimes other things. So it's
Yeah.
it's yeah, I mean, those sorts of things do resonate. Hey, look, the fact that more and more people are conscious of the fact that the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill
Mm.
Wilson, that, and I didn't quite realize until recently that it was two separate psychedelic experiences, that it was an experience with a very powerful and very and somewhat dangerous psychedelic called belladonna, which actually
Oh.
gave him the first insights into appreciating how, what became Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, some of the vision
Hmm.
for AA came out of that experience with belladonna. But then once AA was already established, I think it was his experiences in the 1950s, I think with LSD, that helped him get a handle on his lifelong depression. And so he
Mm.
had two powerful cycles. And now, obviously, the board of AA discouraged him from speaking publicly about it at the time, but it's
Of course.
increasingly well known. It's in his biographies. People in the recovery movement more and more know about it. Somebody was just telling me their kid has been in AA for quite some years. And, they're like, if you've ever had a problem with one drug, you can't use any other drugs, right? If you had a problem with
Right.
alcohol, you can't smoke weed. If you had a problem with
Right.
heroin, you can't, if which, is true for some people, but not true for many others. I mean, God knows I know
Hmm.
people who had a major problem with opiates or cocaine or booze, for whom marijuana turned out to be something that they might have a dependent relationship with, but it allowed them to really lead highly successful lives. But even
Hmm.
in the 12-step movement now, there's a growing recognition that the psychedelics are something different. that these plant
Yeah.
medicines are non-addictive. To call them a drug, yes, and by some definition they're a drug, but in other respects they're a therapy, and that they can be very helpful. And in a way, it honors the founder of AA, Bill W., to kind of acknowledge
Mm.
this and to let this stuff emerge into the recovery world.
Yeah, and I know so many addicts or so many alcoholics who are now sober, who have now had like experiences with plant medicines and changed
Hmm.
everything for them. And a lot of people that I know who've gotten sober lately and are sponsoring others are starting to channel people and send them in my direction, other people's directions about, hey, I've got this person I'm sponsoring and they're really struggling and we sort of all collectively think that psychedelics might help, and like what can you share with us about
Yeah.
it and what could they look at?
I mean, it's amazing. One of the people I interviewed on my podcast, Psychoactive, Elias Dakwar, professor at Columbia, and he was doing research funded by the government on ketamine and addiction. And there's obviously
Mm,
lots of things with other drugs on this. I mean, I say two things that really stand out for me. One is when NIDA finally gave a grant to do psilocybin research on addiction, it was on tobacco, cigarette smoking. Right. And so
mm,
here's something that, we don't think about in the same way we think about heroin, cocaine, or alcohol addiction. But in a small study that Matt Johnson at Hopkins had found really promising
mhm,
results. And so now he's got the resources from NIDA to really do something more substantial on this. So I think that's very interesting. And then on the other side, I'm just fascinated by ibogaine. I mean, because
oh yeah.
ibogaine, it does this like ayahuasca, like mescaline, like psilocybin. It does that kind of powerful, potentially powerful spiritual experience, especially in a guided setting that may help people process and get beyond their addictions. And more, I'm sure much of your audience knows about all of that. But the neat thing about ibogaine is it seems to eliminate the withdrawal symptom from opioids and some other substances. So, if
Mm,
you're trying to process a heroin addiction, ayahuasca, you're still going to end up going through some withdrawal, which can be difficult.
right.
But with ibogaine, it's knocking out that withdrawal symptom. So there's something else
Wild.
going on with ibogaine, that's I mean, there's got to be more research to understand what exactly that is. And then, meanwhile, I guess the third thing is when you begin to realize that ibogaine and maybe ayahuasca, maybe the others, if you look at the traditional uses, they're not just being used for addiction, right? These are being used,
Mm,
for spirituality. They're the basis of religions, the Bwiti religion in
mhm,
Gabon and the Native American Church and a range of others around the world. But they're also used as part of health and wellness in these traditional societies. And then one of the questions with those things is, well, what else is going on in this plant that's not just about consciousness, but that's actually about, the human body, our human organism. Now,
mm,
of course, the two can't be totally
yeah.
disentangled. I just interviewed Gabor Mate on my podcast, and his whole thing is about trauma, prenatal trauma,
Yeah.
early age trauma, but all the evidence about the ways that so many types of illnesses are more prevalent in people who had various types of traumas when they were younger, right? And so we
Mm,
see that, and that being able to process that stuff with or without psychedelics, is so that role in basic broader physical wellness is pivotal. Barrett, let me pause 1 second to plug my
sure.
computer because it looks like it's fading.
Sure, no worries.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I won't keep you much longer. I know you got to run.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, it's powerful, especially I like to look at ayahuasca, for instance, and two different plants that you combine for ayahuasca, the actual healing properties they have on the body, I don't think can be just attributed to putting DMT and an MAO inhibitor in you, right? Like there's
Hmm.
something to the chacruna, for instance, that actually can get in there and help your body heal, beyond just like a mental perspective. And that's a lot of what these things do. If you're ready to do the work, I don't know that they will have the same effects on someone who's not ready to show up and do the work as well, who's ready to
Although
introspectively
it
go
raises
deeper.
this interesting issue, right? Which is that if you could, as pharmaceutical companies, both startups and more established ones try to figure out, is there something going on chemically? It's
Mm,
conceivable that one outcome of all this research may be effectively pills or other
hmm
types of just medicines that turn out to have medical properties that help people even independent of the entire, what we associate with the ayahuasca psychedelic experience. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think if in fact it turns out that these plants turn out to have chemicals that can be isolated, I mean, I kind of hate the fact that it means that these things are going to land up costing a fortune. I mean, pharmaceutical companies are going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to figure it out and to get them through all the double
hmm
blind controlled studies and get it approved by the FDA and blah, 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 blah. And then it'll be covered by insurance, So that part of it I don't particularly care for. But the fact that it might result in some effective medicines and medications to help
hmm
people even apart from the psychedelic thing, because to my mind it's not either or. In the same way that some people, I mean even with the whole commercialization of cannabis that's happening, and now we're seeing it with psychedelics, I think the nice thing that exists with both these substances, is that if you want to opt out of the commercialized or capitalist model, so long as there's a right to grow your own, right?
mm
Or to obtain it from a friend, small level non-commercial transfer, or whatever, which,
hmm
most of the states in marijuana have the preserve the right to grow your own plants up to a point. With the psychedelics initiatives, the Colorado one was quite bold in this regard, right? And we have to be careful that people don't take advantage of how wide open the Colorado initiative is on the decrim piece to kind of take
mm
advantage of it in a way that causes the public to turn against it, right? But the fact of the matter is that I think that, the capitalist model, the for-profit model, the highly commercialized model, the role that big pharma, well, it's not big pharma yet, it's small pharma right now, but eventually could be big pharma. Yes, there's all corrosive elements to that sort of stuff, but the fact is that part of the benefit of all that medical research going on, scientific research, is that it's destigmatizing psychedelics. It's
mm
helping people understand that, God, if a doctor can prescribe psilocybin, well, how bad can it be if somebody's growing their own mushrooms at home and taking the same drug that way, right? And so
yeah.
long as nobody's going to jail for making their own mushrooms at home or growing their own San Pedro, to get mescaline out of, um, you know, that's all well and good. I mean, the risks
hmm
happens when we start relying on white powders that are being manufactured in the, illicit market, as is the
Ugh,
case with fentanyl, right? I mean, or some
right.
of these other designer drugs. That's where people are getting massively harmed. But that's the
hmm
problem of an unregulated drug supply. So having a world in which we have a regulated drug supply that's available maybe by prescription or in some, kind of, in between status, while at the same time people can, grow their own or get it from friends, I think that it's not either or. I think these things can move forward in tandem. The only thing I don't like is when I see, people who are on the for-profit side start to oppose decriminalization, start to oppose the rights of individuals to grow their own. I remember this happened with GW Pharmaceutical, which was really a pioneering firm in terms of getting the first approval by FDA and foreign FDAs for Sativex and Epidiolex, to help with, to be using cannabis for dealing with different types of epileptic conditions. But then that same company, which breaks through, then hires a former deputy drug czar to lobby against the medical marijuana movement. And that was just despicable, right?
Yeah.
So it's, you know, yeah, or even when this marijuana company is asking me about joining the board, and the first thing I say, look, if you guys are ever opposing home grow, I can't even talk to you guys about joining. They said, no, 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 we're not. We're good. We get it. We're behind it. But that kind of greed and narrow mindedness that people coming into either marijuana or psychedelics, where they want to ban that thing, as
Mm.
as if Budweiser got all obsessed with trying to ban people from making their own beer at home or something like that. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
things can't go that way.
it
Yeah.
is crazy. Well, what's coming down the pipeline for you? What are you most excited about moving forwards with all of this?
That's a great question. I mean, as I mentioned to you in Las Vegas, my podcast, Psychoactive, it was nice. It was growing a growing following all around the world, but unfortunately, the
Mm,
numbers were not big enough to justify iHeart renewing it. So that's
mm,
gonna, I'll finish off my first 80 episodes, 2 seasons, in January, and I have to figure out whether I want to continue it in I was a little bit spoiled having the opportunity to do it with iHeart
mhm.
and with Darren Aronofsky's production company, Protozoa. So I
Oh,
have to figure out
cool.
if I want to keep doing that. Maybe it's time for me to sit my ass down and write my book that I've been meaning to write forever, which would be kind of part, policy book, advocacy book, and memoir. So that's on my mind. Maybe I'll join the board of this cannabis company, and I'll have to spend a lot of time learning that because I don't really know the for-profit world in that kind of way. And then for
Mm,
some reason, recently I've been just getting all sorts of invitations to be on the road speaking, like where I met you in Las Vegas at that
mhm.
what was it called, Remind conference, the 1 day
Yeah.
psychedelics and business conference before the huge MJ Biz conference. But I'm speaking at cannabis conferences, psychedelics conferences. I'm going to recovery conferences. I'm speaking around the U.S. I was just in Nigeria and Sierra Leone giving speeches and meeting with
Mm,
government officials and advocates there. A little consulting role. So I'd say at this point, I'm having a lot of fun. I mean,
cool.
building and running Drug Policy Alliance, and before it had a different name for 23 years. It was a monumental enterprise. I did it relentlessly without ever taking a break. I finally handed off the
Mm.
reins 5 years ago. At a moment of my choosing. It took life easy for a few years, and the pandemic hit, and now it feels like I'm kind of getting back out there and enjoying it and just picking my spots without having to have the responsibilities of running an organization with 80 employees and raising the money and dealing with boards and bubbling everything else. So I say overall,
Yeah.
life is good, and continuing to explore with other types of substances is also part of something I enjoy doing, and I have now more time and
Oof.
space for that as well.
Ah, I love that for you. I really do.
Yeah, I've had a lucky life, Barrett. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Can
yeah.
continue to dive deep. And if you ever want to share your experiences, I am happy to listen.
Well,
And
thank you so much, Barrett. I mean, I really appreciate the
mhm.
opportunity, and you're asking me to be on your podcast, and I want to wish you all the best with it,
Oh, thank you.
and with everything else. Yeah.
Thank you. And where can my listeners keep up with you? What platforms are you on?
I mean, at this point, go to listen to my podcast, Psychoactive, which is on all the major platforms. And even after I stop doing new episodes with iHeart, it'll still be available on all the major platforms. And I guess the other way is, my email is ethan@nadelmann.net, and I can't promise to respond, but there's a decent likelihood. So people should feel free to just email me if they have questions or thoughts, and I'll do my best to respond.
Perfect. Well, I'll have that all linked up in the show notes for you. And thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, well, thanks, Barrett. I really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and review this podcast wherever you're listening. I'm so grateful to have you on this journey with me. Until next time.